1 Timothy chapter 5. And again, this material, I think I mentioned Wednesday night here to the group. I suspect that there are a lot of us who have never heard this chapter taught or preached. I can tell you that I never remember hearing it. I pray that you've all read it ahead of time. You all know where we're going. Did I say 1 Timothy? Yeah. I hope so. Okay. Yeah. Started doubting myself. 1 Timothy chapter 2. Or chapter 5. I'm sorry. Sorry. I had it right the first time, right? Just shut up. Yeah. Okay. All right. Anyway, it's been a long morning. Again, a lot of this material, and I pray that where I started to go there, I pray that you all, you know where we're going when we're studying through a book in the Bible. So please be reading the Scripture ahead of time. Read through, a couple of times in the week leading up to each sermon. It really can help you have a grasp on what we're talking about. And then, for those of you who did do that this week, this chapter 5, your first impression can really be, okay, boy, where's he going to go with this type of thing? So you're about to find out here. So, my intro to chapter 5, in the church, within the church, relationships, interactions, conduct, leadership, and even confrontation are dealt with in these verses. And I tell you again, as I have mentioned at the beginning of this study through 1 Timothy, the original instructions were given to whom? Timothy. This young man, Timothy, who was a pastor, most likely in his mid-20s to mid-30s somewhere. And the congregation that he was serving, was in what city? Ephesus. The city of Ephesus. Good. But, this was a long time ago, and this was originally to a specific pastor, young pastor, and also, again, the church that he was serving so long ago. But what have we been saying about God's principles? They don't change. They endure. The Psalms say repeatedly, God's principles endure forever. And so, though we might initially read these verses and say, what in the world does this have to do with me today? I assure you, there are principles that still apply. God's principles don't go away. The culture changes, the audience changes, the specific applications change, but the principles don't. Thing is, the church is described in the New Testament by a lot of metaphors, a lot of analogies. Sometimes Christians are referred to as soldiers in the army, right? Sometimes we are referred to as parts of the body, right? Don't say what part of the body you think I am. But sometimes we are referred to as competitors, athletic competitors in a race, right? Sometimes we're described as fellow servants in the household of faith. But more frequently than any other way, all people who have true saving faith in Jesus, and people in even local congregations like this one right here, are referred to as being members of a family. Members of a family. That is the most common analogy used to describe us. All believers in general, but then specifically gathered congregations like this one. God is our Father. Jesus is our elder brother. We are joint heirs to the Father's kingdom with Jesus. We are all what? Think of the family analogy here. With each other, we are, it's not a hard one. We are brothers and sisters. Yeah. Just took you a while. But you got there. We're all brothers and sisters. We're family. And I talk about how wonderful that can be and often is here with this group, but it doesn't take much to tear down a family, does it? And some of us have seen that in our relative families, our earthly families type things. Is the same thing in a church. So how are we to treat one another in the family? And how do we handle things in our family. This chapter gives us some of God's perspectives, some of God's expectations relative to these things. 3 specifics are kind of dealt with here. First of all, the church family as a whole. Secondly, widows within the church family especially. And I would say, as I will say as we move on, and I think the same kinds of things that are applied specifically to widows here in chapter 5 can apply to a lot of people and situations and circumstances. And then lastly, spiritual leaders within a given family. So let's look at the first 2 verses here in chapter 5. First 2 verses, do not rebuke an older man harshly. Notice it doesn't say don't rebuke them at all, right? It says just don't rebuke them harshly. But exhort him as if he were your father. Treat younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, and younger women as sisters, but with absolute purity. First of all, love is the backbone of any family, including our church family. Within the framework of love, then, within the framework of love that we should have for each other as fellow believers, brothers and sisters in Christ, something that is necessary yet often overlooked and not pleasant by any stretch of the word is confrontation. Confrontation of sin. The Bible says we are to confront sin. And the Bible says that all family members, all brothers and sisters in Christ, have a responsibility to confront each other about sin. And spiritual leaders in our family have the ultimate and final responsibility to confront sin. And oh, how strange it is that something that is so clearly presented in the Bible is not only seldom seen in churches today, but actually derided as improperly judging somebody. Bless you. Now, we must not confront sin in the church like we're attacking an enemy. Don't mistake that either. Again, we're brothers and sisters. But we must confront sin firmly, but with love. And do so with an intent to convict and encourage folks, our brothers and sisters, to live the holy life that we're called to live. In obedience to what? The Bible. To the Bible, the God of Word, the Word of God. That's how we know how to live in obedience to God, is He tells us in His Word, in the Bible. Here are some specifics given here. If a younger man needs to confront an older man, he must do so thoughtfully. The older man should be corrected and disciplined, but as a father, he is to be approached and exhorted and appealed to and pleaded with, just as we would speak to the father that raised us. We must not compromise the Word of God. We must not be approving of sin. But we should speak with love and respect and gentleness, again, as we would to our own father. If a rebuke must be given, it must be done gently and with love, and even a dose of sadness, not with anger. Similarly, older women should be treated as we would treat our own mother, younger men and women as we would treat our own brother and sister. And this way of interacting with others in the church applies to all different kinds of situations, but don't miss that confrontation and rebuke of sin is the first thing in view in these first 2 verses in 1 Timothy chapter 5. We are to confront sin in the church, not accept it. Please don't miss that. And I surely have to believe that you all understand that this is not the way it's often looked at in our society or in churches today. We are to confront sin in the church. How do you think the whole church is doing with that? The church as a whole. How do you think we're doing with that? I say not very well. I'm talking about all churches, universal church. And let me ask you, how do you think people in churches generally respond when they're confronted about sin in their lives? Not so well. Note that the interaction and confrontation with younger women is especially mentioned there in verse 2. That any interaction with younger women, especially from, pastoral standpoints, is to be done with complete purity. There's absolutely no room for even a hint of inappropriate behavior between men and women in the church. And surely most of all in regard to men who are spiritual leaders. There have been many, many spiritual leaders who have fallen because of becoming inappropriately involved with a woman in the church. Well, I have a little introduction to then verses 3 through 16. Throughout the entire Bible, we see that God is concerned for the needs of the helpless. God has compassion on those who truly, truly cannot care for themselves. And He expects His people, and who would God's people be today? Those with true saving faith in Jesus are God's people, and He expects us then to feel the same way He does, have compassion for those who truly cannot care for themselves. And He expects us to not just care, but what? To do something about it. In particular, the Bible often cites the responsibility of people of God to care for widows and orphans. They are often singled out in particular. Life for widows and orphans was certainly a whole lot more difficult in the days of the writing of the Bible, since they didn't have the welfare programs available then that are available now, certainly like in our area. But the first thing is to remember that in a lot of the parts of the world, do they have governmental welfare programs like we do? Now, first of all, understand that there are a lot of parts in the world where Christians, there is no first step of somebody at a disadvantage to go to a governmental welfare system to help them survive. They don't have such a thing. And that's where Christians really have to step into the mix. And it starts here in their own family, in the local church. But it's not excluding going outside of that either. Secondly, I believe that these instructions in 1 Timothy chapter 5 about widows still have direct application to us today, where we do have governmental welfare programs to assist people. I think, number one, there are still widows who struggle and need help, as well as, again, other people that even with governmental programs struggle. Number two, there are still proper ways that we should deal with widows, interact with them. And number three, there are still proper ways for widows themselves to conduct themselves, to handle their affairs, to live their lives. Again, I believe these instructions also give us guidance for dealing with anyone in need, not just widows, as well as guidelines for proper behavior of anyone who is in need. Widows are the main focus in these verses, but Paul mentions family and parents and grandparents and relatives in the immediate family within this discussion. I think these verses clearly indicate that the widows in view are those who attend a specific church. That the discussion is dealing with people who are a part of a specific church and how that church should help those in their church as needed and as properly needed. But the instructions, I think, could be used in an application to deal with any widows or any people in need even outside of the church or even in someone else's church. So with that intro, read verses 3 through 8 with me. 3 through 8. Give proper recognition to those widows who are what? Really in need. So it's not all widows, it's widows who are really in need. Verse 4, but if a widow has children or grandchildren, these should learn first of all to put their religion into practice by caring for their own family, and so repaying their parents and grandparents. For this is what? Pleasing to God. The widow who is what? Really in need and left all alone puts her hope in God and continues night and day to pray and to ask God for help. But the widow who lives for pleasure is dead even while she lives. Give the people these instructions so that no one may be open to blame. Anyone who does not provide for their relatives, and especially for their own household, has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Even in the early days of the church, not all widows needed or deserved help. That it's clear. I had you repeat that phrase with me several times. Widows who are really in need. A church is not obligated to provide financial support to every woman who is a widow, regardless of circumstances. The church is not required to provide assistance for any person, regardless of what the circumstances are. This is a big part of these instructions that apply to us still today. There must actually be a need, and as we'll soon see, relatives, family, immediate family have the first responsibility to actually care for their family members according to God. Therefore, it is not only fair, but it's actually proper and necessary for churches to have standards and processes to evaluate each situation of potential need on its own merits. Before decisions are made, are we going to provide some financial assistance for this person? Sadly, I have to tell you that it's even more necessary today to have checks and balances built in, things to evaluate circumstances before, just saying, oh, we'll give some money to help this person or whatever. It's because scammers and users of the system have become so common. Sadly, even in our area, we've experienced it numerous times through the years, that people play the system and people scam the system. So first, God calls earthly relatives to take care of their own. If a widow is in need of help, her family has the first responsibility. And again, I believe that if anyone is in need of help, not just widows, the same principle carries over, that their family has the first burden of responsibility to help them out. Again, I'm sad to say that the personal responsibility to care for family seems to be another value that is fading these days. But how it pleases God when His children live up to their responsibilities. Understand, again, God is saying this. He's saying, you're a child or a grandchild. You have a responsibility to help tend to your mother or grandmother if she's in a situation where she's no longer able to take care of herself. Do you have any other way to take these words we just read? I don't. The only thing you can do if you don't like them is say, well, that was applying to that culture back then. And that's when you will incur my wrath. And I will say, no, God's principles are what? Enduring. Enduring. The principles themselves are enduring. Down through the ages, even pagan cultures have believed in the responsibility of family to take care of their own. And therefore, Christians who are able to help but refuse to help, provide for the needs of immediate family members. What did this verse say? They're even worse than unbelievers. So again, the main focus is talking about believing people in churches. That if they refuse to do what even the pagan world recognizes as being appropriate, these believers are worse than unbelievers in what they're doing or not doing, as the case would be. Therefore, Christians who are able to help but refuse to provide for the needs of their immediate family members, again, should actually be confronted by their church. Oh, that'll be comfortable, right? Yeah, everybody wants to sign up for that duty, right? But that's the reality that goes along with this, that if there are people there that should be lending a hand in the immediate family, and someone's asking the church, to provide help, and it's like, well, wait a minute here. The Bible says the first line of defense is the family. What are you all doing? Well, we can't, we have our own stuff to tend to. I missed those exceptions there when we read the verses, right? This is a part of what the process is supposed to look like. You want to know what this has to do with us today? No, we don't. Our widows aren't in the kind of shape that they were back in those days. If a woman lost her husband back in those days, it was a lot worse than what it is today. But the principle still remains. And are there not still people in need today? And do people not still come to the church and say, can you help?
Yes.
And should the church not say, well, maybe, but let's check off this list of requirements and responsibilities, and what's the family doing? Who all's the family? Who all's involved? Who all could be maybe providing help? What's being done? And as we're going to see here, how's the person themselves that's in need, how are they living? Well, we're going to see that here in a little bit, and that's going to ruffle more feathers. Understand, we're teaching what the Bible says here, right? Don't shoot the messenger. A widow who is truly in need has no one to help her, or at least no one who can supply all of her needs. And if she's a woman who seeks to live a godly life, a woman who earnestly prays for God's help, that's like one kind of a candidate for help. But then a contrasting candidate for help would be a widow who focuses on earthly pleasures and oftentimes sinful pleasures. And at best, she's a backslidden believer with a dead faith, according to these verses we just read. And at worst, she's actually even an unbeliever. She's spiritually dead. What are some modern day examples? Again, don't throw stuff at me, but here's some modern day examples that I would give you that would fit into what we're studying here in these verses. You have a godly widow. She has no immediate family who are willing or able to help meet her needs. She gets by the best she can. She spends money only on essentials. It can easily be seen that she's frugal with what income she does have. And she refuses to resort to live-in boyfriends, which is sexual immorality, to help make ends meet. Contrast that to a widow who is obviously not living for Jesus. She spends money on things that most people would agree, those aren't essentials. You're asking for help, and yet, some of the way you're spending your money, and again, I hear of some of you already in your minds, well, what's business of you? Well, how they're spending their money. What business is of ours if you're asking us to give you money? Biblically, we are to, that's what this is talking about. If somebody is living that way, we have a right, actually a requirement by God to say, well, look, I don't really want to give specifics beyond that because I will tick people off, but there are certain things that can obviously be seen, like if you have money to do that and that and that and that, sorry, we can't help. And some people don't like that. But I say it's biblical. The point is that still today there must be standards and a process of evaluation to determine who is really in need. It is biblical. Verses 9 and 10. No widow may be put on the list of widows unless she is over 60, has been faithful to her husband, and is well known for her good deeds, such as bringing up children, showing hospitality, washing the feet of the Lord's people, helping those in trouble, and devoting herself to all kinds of good deeds. Again, here you have character qualities that are required to be considered to determine whether someone deserves to receive help, financial help, or otherwise. These were likely some standards for widows in the early church. First of all, to be put on this widows list, and the over 60, again, the deal with being over 60 had to do with, especially in that age, ladies over 60 were much less likely to be able to remarry and get into or get out of their financial difficulty situation. And so the truly older widows would be put on somewhat of a perpetual list, a list of widows where they would need help indefinitely just to survive, type of a thing. And one of the rules in that culture was no women should be considered for lifetime welfare unless they're over 60. It was a dividing line then. I don't have anything I know of that I would compare that directly to today, but you understand the point. The principle remains that we set standards to say, well, in these kinds of circumstances, we have every responsibility to evaluate and say, here's a lady, okay, she lost her husband and so forth, but she has various means that maybe we can help her out to start with, but she has various means that she can go through that she should be able to bring herself up out of this position she's in. And that is not only proper for us to do, it's actually required, according to these verses, for us to do things like that, make decisions like that. These older widows in the churches who had, again, been living godly lives likely dedicated the remainder of their lives to serving Jesus and serving the church after they were placed on this widow's list. They probably even took vows to do it. That they vowed to, the church can just give us enough to survive in that culture, enough food to just survive. We will serve the church and spend the rest of our lives serving Jesus, and we make a vow to do that for the rest of our lives. The examples of the requirements to be placed on this widow list, again at that time, are not as important today as the general understanding that some kinds of standards of godly conduct and common sense must still be applied when a church is deciding about providing financial support for people, quote unquote, in need. Churches have a responsibility to help, but again, there are standards and requirements that must be met by those who are seeking that help. Verses 11 through 13. As for younger widows, do not put them on such a list. When their sensual desires overcome their dedication to Christ, they want to marry. Thus they bring judgment on themselves because they have broken their first pledge. Besides, they get into the habit of being idle and going about from house to house. And not only do they become idlers, but also busybodies who talk nonsense, saying things they ought not to. And so this whole thing is, in contrast to the older widows, the younger widows, and again, I think these principles can be applied to other situations other than just widows today. These younger widows had a much greater opportunity and a likelihood to be able to remarry and regain financial stability and support and so forth. The younger widows, again, were in a place where they could actually go into, resume doing what any younger woman would do in that culture, which would have been to seek to marry and generally seek to have children and have a family and so forth. They were supposed to basically, once they got through their mourning period for their husband and so forth, they were young enough, they were to pursue like any other young unmarried woman would do in that culture. Again, this is all about a church having standards and processes for how to handle and make decisions regarding benevolent needs, regarding requests for financial help. And you would be surprised how rude some of the people are that I have dealt with over the years. When we sometimes even after we had given them some help, and we finally say, the teats run dry here, no more. But you'd be surprised how rude they get because you cheap people, you're supposed to be all Christians and you can't even keep helping me and stuff like that. I mean, it's been pretty amazing. Verses 14 and 15. So I counsel younger widows to marry, to have children, to manage their homes, to give the enemy no opportunity for slander. Some have, in fact, already turned away to follow Christ. And so, again, younger widows in that culture where the advice was to have them do what other unmarried young women do in a God-honoring way. And then neither the church nor them would be open to criticism, and they would be better able to not be in a situation where they were straying off God's pathway for life and following Satan and the many temptations that Satan can throw in your way. How is that more likely for younger widows? Again, a younger person, and they're basically having support given to them, regular support given. Let's face facts. Governmental welfare systems, often you see that same effect, to where you have people that are healthy and able and so forth, but they're given money for rent and they're given money for food and so on and so forth, and they seem to have lots of time to go do other things and get in trouble. And whatnot, and I could go on and on about that, but I've probably already offended enough of you as it is. But that's what Paul was talking about in that culture. I'm saying that's a comparative to our culture. You don't want to be providing help to somebody where you're just basically giving them an ability to live off somebody else's dime and not put themselves to it and get after it themselves to live life and provide for themselves and so forth. That's really, you want to compare what Paul said in that culture and to our culture today, I say right there it is. Verse 16. If any woman who is a believer has widows in her care, she should continue to help them, and not let the church be burdened with them, so that the church can help then those widows who what? Are really in need. And so, again, all Christian women are commanded to help out the widows in their family. Like we said, children and grandchildren have the first dibs. They're the ones that have the first line of responsibility to help for their mothers and grandmothers. But then the second line of support would come from any other women in that family unit, and even an extended family unit, to provide help, to help support them, to where the church then doesn't come in until after that. Because there are some women or some people who need help that don't have anybody, right? And so the church should devote their resources to the people that just don't have anybody to help them, while people that do have others to help them in their families should do that. Because the church can't take care of everybody. You follow the line of thought? Doesn't it, I mean, seriously, doesn't it make sense? Can you see how the principles still fit today? I say again, this is a God-commanded responsibility for families to take care of their own. And it applies just as much today as it did in the early decades of the church. Yes, our culture is very different today, but many widows still need help today, as do many men, women, and children. There are lots of true needs out there, right? I think we all understand that. At least to some degree we understand that and agree with that. Followers of Jesus, as much as they are able, should provide that help within their own families. And churches should then provide support as much as they are able for those who have no family to help them. Because again, most churches have limited resources. Churches can help, but they only have so much to go around as well, and some churches obviously have a lot less than others, so again, sometimes decisions have to be made. Individual Christians as well as churches need to take these commands and responsibilities seriously, especially but not limited to within the church family. We have instructions about how this stuff is supposed to work according to God. The problem is there would be many who would still have a problem with it. Verses 17 and 18. The elders who direct the affairs of the church are worthy of double honor, especially those whose work is preaching and teaching. For Scripture says, "Do not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain, and the worker deserves his wages." So the discussion now returns to the focus on who within the church? Elders, spiritual leaders, and I remind you that elders is used here, but back in chapter 3, both the terms of elder and overseer were both used, and elsewhere in the New Testament, two other terms for spiritual leaders in the church are used: shepherd and pastor, which actually come from the same Greek word, poimen. Pastor's actually only used once, even though that's the most common name for a spiritual leader in the church. But the focus now returns to spiritual leaders in the church. As we've discussed before, elders and overseers, shepherds and pastors, again, these interchangeable names for spiritual leaders in the church as mandated in other places in the New Testament, such as 1 Corinthians 9, verses 7 through 9, 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 12, Hebrews 13, verse 17. In these places it says that good spiritual leaders in the church are to be respected and obeyed, and those who preach, teach, and lead the church as their full-time jobs are to at least be paid fairly. And then this term, double honor, used in verse 17, likely refers to paying hardworking full-time spiritual leaders generously. And I just don't even like to talk about that stuff, but that's the explanation of it. And if anybody has more questions about that, contact me otherwise, and we can talk about it. Verses 19 and 20. Do not entertain an accusation against an elder unless it is brought by, what's it say? 2 or 3 witnesses. But those elders who are sinning, you are to reprove or rebuke before everyone, so that the others may take warning. So what's that about? Well, first of all, God holds spiritual leaders, and especially those who preach and teach, to a high spiritual standard. And God will judge us more strictly. See James 3, verse 1 and Hebrews 13, verse 17. Those of us who do this will be held accountable in ways that nobody else will be before God. That's one of many reasons I take very seriously what I do here. These spiritual leaders are very much in the public spotlight, and therefore they are especially vulnerable to false attacks, vindictive attacks, frivolous attacks, all that kind of stuff. The church is not to even consider a charge or an accusation of sin against a spiritual leader unless it is brought forward by at least what? 2 or 3 witnesses. But if there are multiple witnesses, and they do bring accusation of sin against the spiritual leader, and the spiritual leader is found to be guilty of that, he is to be rebuked how? Publicly in front of the entire church. It says, again, violations of the qualifications of spiritual leaders that we went over back in chapter 3 probably would be good cause for rebuke, but other sins could demand a public rebuke as well. Depending on the severity of the sin, the spiritual leader could actually be removed from his position, either temporarily for a period of time or permanently. And the purpose of the public rebuke is that so that the others are appropriately warned. Who would most likely the others be?
The other spiritual leaders?
Yeah, the other spiritual leaders in the church. That they would be warned that, look, you misstepped in these kinds of ways. You have latitude. There has to be multiple witnesses of it. But if it's proven that you've sinned in these kinds of ways, then you will be held to the same fire. You will be publicly rebuked before the entire congregation for what you did. Verse 21. I charge you in the sight of God and in Christ Jesus and the elect angels to keep these instructions without partiality and to do nothing out of favoritism. I think the phrase, these instructions here in verse 21, I think that refers to all the matters involving spiritual leaders that have been talked about here in 1 Timothy, from how they handle widows and how leaders handle other people in the church, to how they handle compensation and discipline among themselves, and all those issues, all those things that we've talked about. Everything spiritual leaders do must be done without partiality and favoritism. The same standards of evaluation must be used for everybody. This is singled out as a solemn command given with not only God as a witness, the Father and the Son both as witnesses, but also who else as witnesses? The elect angels, it says. Although the reference to these supernatural witnesses is likely just to highlight the importance of this command, we kind of can't just skip over the elect angels. Pretty much everybody agrees that elect angels are the holy angels of God, as opposed to who? Satan and the other angels who rebelled against God, and all became demons and so forth. Pretty much everybody agrees that the elect angels are the holy angels of God still in heaven who didn't rebel against Him. But why are they referred to here as the elect angels of God in the Word of God here? First of all, I and others say it has to parallel the designation of the elect among human beings. It's the same term. It's the same Greek word. God elected and chose certain human beings whom He prevented from rejecting Him, as otherwise they would have done, while allowing the rest of human beings to make their own choice about God, which is always to reject Him. In the same way, then, we would think that the elect angels are those God sovereignly chose, certain angels from among all of them that He created, that He would prevent them from rebelling against Him, as they otherwise would have done, while He allowed the rest of the angels to make the choice, and their choice was to rebel against God. That's what I think the significance, I and others would think the significance of the elect angels is. It is amazing to me that many commentators don't even touch that. They don't even say anything about that, which I don't get. But I felt that I needed to at least touch on that. Verse 22, home stretch, hang in there, the suffering is almost over for you. 22, do not be hasty in the laying on of hands, and do not share in the sins of others. Keep yourself pure. First of all, what have we talked about the significance of the laying on of hands? Anybody remember just briefly what the significance of that in the church when we, especially the laying on of hands of spiritual leaders?
Ordaining them to that ministry.
Okay, it's a symbolic act that historically in the church, it was a demonstration of other spiritual leaders, primarily, that we are approving of this man to be a spiritual leader. We believe this man is called by God to do these things. We are laying our hands upon him to symbolize that and to demonstrate that and pray him into this ministry that he's entering into. So one of the best ways then to prevent unqualified men and men without the necessary skills and abilities from becoming spiritual leaders is to not appoint any man to a position of spiritual leadership in the church too quickly, without due time to review. Much time and consideration must be invested in identifying, reviewing, examining, and testing candidates for spiritual leadership. This verse makes it clear also, and this is an important point, another big thing relative to church government. This verse makes it clear that existing spiritual leaders have the responsibility to appoint new spiritual leaders, using a thorough biblical process. I will tell you that many churches don't do it that way. But biblically, again, this verse makes it clear that it's the spiritual leaders who are the ones who determine and send out into ministry additional spiritual leaders. And so that's the way it's supposed to work, with a thorough biblical review process and the requirements of a spiritual leader that we looked at in chapter 3 in 1 Timothy being taken into consideration, as well as natural abilities, character, all those kinds of things should be reviewed thoroughly by existing spiritual leaders, and then the existing spiritual leaders would appoint new spiritual leaders. To place a man into a position of spiritual leadership in the church too quickly, without this very careful examination and consideration, makes the spiritual leaders who called and approved him to the position partly responsible if that man ends up failing in leadership because of a lack of ability or because of sin in his life. And spiritual leaders must always strive to keep themselves pure or without sin in all ways, including in the appointment of other spiritual leaders. And that actually leads to verse 23, which is another verse that's often talked about what it means. It's actually, I think, a qualifier for what Paul just got done saying to Timothy about you need to keep yourself from sin as a spiritual leader. But then he sort of says in verse 23 something that ties into that. First of all, verse 23 says, stop drinking only water and use a little wine because of your stomach and your frequent illnesses. And so Bible scholars have historically held different opinions about this verse. I believe the best understanding is that Timothy likely had frequent problems with stomach or intestinal sickness, at least partially caused by contaminated water. You understand in ancient culture, they're still in places in the world. That's why we have Water for Good trying to drill pure water wells in Central Africa, because they still drink impure water. They drink water with bacteria in it that makes people sick. And back in that age, again, that was common in ancient times, which it was in the early decades of the church and frankly, the early centuries of the church. And so because of this, what we would believe that Timothy probably had these problems with his gut, probably frequently got sick because he probably had refused to drink any wine because he felt that he shouldn't as a spiritual leader type of deal. And that basically Paul here was saying, look, I just told you you need to be pure and don't sin, but you're not sinning if you drink some wine, which was common what a lot of people did then, to avoid drinking so much of contaminated water that's making you sick so often. Some of the explanations for that. They generally, they didn't have bags of Domino sugar. When you make wine, I used to make wine, a lot of you know that anyway, but I don't anymore, so don't throw things at me, but I used to make wine, and, what's one of the big processes that creates alcohol in wine? Well, what ingredient? Sugar. There's natural sugar in fruit and in the grape, but you add a bunch of sugar because the sugar is what actually gets converted to alcohol. And so they didn't have bags of Domino sugar on the shelf in the early decades of AD, in the 40s and 50s and 60s AD and well after that. Oftentimes they just only used the fruit itself. And so with less sugar in the wine, there's actually ends up being less alcohol, for one thing. Also, the fermentation process. Today you buy winemaker's yeast. It's a specialized yeast that is very efficient in metabolizing the sugar and converting it to alcohol. In those days, they wouldn't have had stuff like that, and the fermentation process was often not overly efficient, and a lot of the sugar wasn't actually converted into alcohol. All this to say that most likely the common wine that was used by a lot of people was much lower in alcohol content than a lot of the wine today, but there was still alcohol in it. There was still a fermentation process, because that's why when you would take impure water or contaminated water and mix it with the fruit and ferment it and so forth, the fermentation process actually kills a lot of the bacteria. And so all this is to explain, there's been so many arguments about this verse, and people that want to drink alcohol, they cite it, and people that don't want to drink, don't think you should drink any alcohol, they cite it and say, that's a wrong understanding of it, and it's been fought about for years. I'm giving you my best explanation I can give you, because again, when you preach through the Bible, through a book of the Bible, verse by verse, I don't skip any verses. And today I know has been tough, but I did my best, worked hard to prepare explanations of what this means. What does this mean to us? And obviously, one of the things, if you buy into my explanation that Paul was saying to Timothy, look, I just told you, you need to keep yourself pure of sin, but look, just because you would drink some wine doesn't mean, you're sinning. He didn't tell him to get drunk. He just said, drink some more wine, which a lot of the people did for the liquid that they needed to take in, instead of all water. Do some of that, because you're getting sick all the time, because you're drinking this water that has, they didn't know what bacteria was and stuff, but they could figure out that water made people sick. And so that's the whole gist of it. And so application today, yes, I'm not going to stand up here and say anything other than I don't believe it is a sin to take an alcoholic drink, but there are lots of other factors that come into play. It is a sin to get drunk, and especially regularly. And, there are other reasons why you need to be very cautious with alcohol. I have seen a lot of alcoholism in my family. I have seen what it does to people. There was a time in my life when I drank way too much, and it caused me problems and so forth. I'm not poo-pooing, or just saying, it's no big deal to drink. It is, and it needs to be done wisely if it's going to be done. And I'm just making the point, though, that many of us, our understanding we have of this verse would be, you got the Apostle Paul, led by the Holy Spirit, telling Timothy to what?
Drink wine.
Drink some wine, a little wine. He didn't tell him to get drunk. He didn't tell him to make a practice of, slamming beers down every night or anything like that. He said, drink a little wine and not just all water, right? But if he told him that, it must not be a sin to drink a little wine, right? Now, little is a relative term, isn't it? I better just shut up. Anyway, let's just leave it at that. The last two verses. Yes, forgive me. Forgive me for even what I was thinking of saying. Verses 24 and 25. Last two verses. The sins of some are obvious, reaching the place of judgment ahead of them. The sins of others trail behind them. In the same way, good deeds are obvious, and even those that are not obvious cannot remain hidden forever. And so it's talking, what's this talking about? This is taking the conversation back to what? You had this little interlude with verse 23 kind of explaining something in addition to verse 22, but what was it talking about back in verse 22 and the verses before? Who? What group of people? Spiritual leaders. The spiritual leaders. And so this is tagging into, again, the last topic with spiritual leaders was not appointing them what? Too quickly. Like, take your time. Make sure you check them out. Make sure you allow some time to go by to make sure these guys are fit to be spiritual leaders before you lay your hands on them and make them spiritual leaders in your church. These last two verses are basically the following up on that. You kind of have this parentheses in between that we had to talk about the drinking wine and everything. That was that little thing that Paul threw in there to say when he told him don't be sinning as a spiritual leader. Keep yourself pure, but don't think you're going to sin just because you drink a little bit of wine to avoid drinking so much contaminated water. Then he went back to what he was really talking about, these last two verses. Again, he's talking about when you review guys, maybe their sins at first you don't see any sins. Maybe there's nothing obvious that you see in them, but you know what? If you kind of track with them for a little while, if there's some sins that are kind of not real obvious. Some people can hide stuff really good. There's things that people get away with doing for some time and like nobody knows it. But eventually, it often comes out. And that's kind of what he's following up with this stuff. He's saying, some sins are obvious. Pretty much right away. We were reviewing this guy, and he has this stuff going on in his life, and we don't want to be appointing him to spiritual leadership. He has a lot of things he needs to get straightened out first. But there might also be some sins that at first glance you don't see any problem, but give it some time. Review the guy a little further. Watch him over a period of time. Talk to more people. Extend the period out long enough that maybe something hidden might show itself. Conversely, when you first look at someone, they might not have any qualities, especially good deeds or things like that really stand out to you. They seem pretty just average to me. I don't really see that they do a lot to help or do this or do that. But the more, sometimes people aren't real flashy about what they do. Sometimes people are willing to help others out behind the scenes without anybody even knowing that they do it. Sometimes people are willing to do a lot of things that aren't obvious at first glance. That's the second part of, that's verse 25, that sometimes you don't see good deeds at first, but over a period of time, then there are some that show up that, oh, boy, he does that. Oh, he's been doing that. Oh, he's been going into that with a group down at the restaurant there leading a Bible study. He never said anything about that here. No, because he wasn't trumpeting himself, and nobody ever said anything about it. But you find out after a while, boy, there's some good qualities here we didn't see at first. Both of those, the fact that there could be bad things that you don't see right away and good things that you don't see right away, are further support for the direction that before you appoint someone as a spiritual leader in a church, you give it some time for a thorough review and for some time to pass so you can make sure there's not something bad that was hidden that comes to light, and that maybe there's some good things that at first you think, well, he's not really doing that much good, but maybe there's stuff there that you just haven't seen yet. And so that's what those last verses are all about. So, probably not the most exciting sermon in the world today. I get that. I hope you found it at least interesting. to learn and to consider how we apply these principles today in our church family here. But even if you didn't think it was interesting or exciting, guess what? You know what it is? It's the Word of God, right? And I will not skip over anything, which a lot of guys will do because it's not the most interesting or exciting sermon. But it is the Word of God. It applies. It explains how we should be doing things in the family of God and how families should be doing things in the family of God. All that stuff applies. God's principles still apply to us today. And I pray that these explanations have helped you at least understand how they do, how they still apply to us today. As always, the question remains then, will we obey? Will we obey and live out these principles within the family of God that we've talked about here today? To close it, I say, I am so glad that I am a part of the family of God. And that's the closing hymn, 419.